Chapter 4 covers the tissue level of organization, and histology is the study of tissues. There are four major types of tissues in the body that you should be aware of. Epithelial tissue, they form coverings and linings. Connective tissue, which is there mainly for support. Muscle tissue for movement, and nerve tissue for control. We're going to be covering each of these four major types of tissue in this chapter. However, most of our work is going to be with the first two, epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Let's start with epithelial tissue. There are two main types, coverings and linings and glandular epithelia. In this video, we're going to concern ourselves with coverings and linings, like the outer layer of your skin, or linings around organs, and inner linings of organs as well. You can see there are many functions associated with epithelial tissue, but we'll look at these functions specifically when we go through each type of epithelial tissue. For now, let's just look at what each of these terms means, like absorption. Absorption is when cells take in material from the outside. Secretion and excretion both have cells eliminating material. However, excretion, cells are eliminating unwanted or waste material, where secretion is where cells let out useful material that they produce. Filtration is a process where fluid is forced through a membrane under pressure. We won't really see much of this in A&P Part 1. Epithelia consists of cells that are held tightly together. Sometimes epithelia exists in a single row of cells, like here. Other times it exists as multiple layers of cells, like in this image right here. If we're looking at this epithelial tissue, we can see it's a covering or a lining, which means at one end is just free space, where at the other end we have deeper tissue, perhaps connective tissue. So we could name these two areas of epithelial tissue. This area up here that's next to the free surface is called the apical surface. Just below it, at the deep end of epithelia, that would be the basal surface. Think of A and B, apical and basal surface. Between epithelial tissue and underlying tissue, we have a membrane that we call the basement membrane. You can also call it the basal lamina. However, basement membrane is probably more accurate because it also includes another lamina or layer called the reticular lamina. So if you see basal lamina or basement membrane, you're fine if you just use those two terms interchangeably. That's a layer of proteins dividing epithelial tissue from underlying tissue. Cells are held tightly together in epithelial tissue. Here we can see the plasma membrane of one cell next to the plasma membrane of another cell. Tight junctions are these proteins that almost act like sutures that hold cells tightly together. Very difficult for any material to pass in between the cells. Desmosomes are like rivets that connect two cells together. So in areas of the body where we need to prevent shear or ripping, like perhaps your top layer of skin, we're going to have desmosomes to hold these cells even tighter together. Gap junctions allow communication between two cells in epithelial tissue and other tissue as well. Here are some characteristics of epithelial tissue. Epithelia is avascular, meaning no blood vessels. So therefore, epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply. It must rely on obtaining its nutrients from underlying tissue, and those nutrients have to diffuse up into the epithelial layer. Epithelial tissue is innervated, though, which means it does have a nerve supply, which we'll see. Epithelial tissue is regenerative, meaning cells in epithelial tissue constantly go through mitosis. So if there's an injury to the tissue, or tissue is being worn by wear and tear, well, it has the ability to regenerate very quickly because of the high turnover rate due to high frequency of mitosis. This is called high regenerative capacity. We name epithelial tissue or classify epithelia by the number of layers that exist in the tissue and the shape of the cells. One layer is called simple. Multiple layers is stratified. If cells are flattened, it's squamous. If cells are cube-shaped, they're cuboidal. If cells are long, or I should say tall and narrow, they're columnar. So we're going to use these two criteria together to classify epithelia. For example, simple squamous or simple columnar, or stratified cuboidal or stratified squamous. If you can't determine the shape of the cell, although here you can, just look at the nucleus. The nucleus mimics the shape of the cell. So a flattened cell will have a flattened nucleus. A cuboidal cell will have a round nucleus. A columnar cell will have a tall and narrow nucleus. So how would you define this epithelia? This is simple squamous. Simple because there's one layer of cells, and squamous because it consists of flattened cells. How would you classify this epithelia? This is a little more difficult because you might be thinking, well, cells are flattened at the apical surface, but cuboidal at the basal surface. When you run into this, what you need to do is use the apical surface always by determining classification. Therefore, this is stratified squamous. Stratified because there's multiple layers of cells, and squamous because the apical surface contains flattened cells. So when epithelial tissue is simple, well, the functions would be absorption, secretion, and filtration. Because we want material to pass through, it's good to have only one layer of cells to do that. When epithelia is stratified or layered, the main function is protection. That's why there are so many layers of cells, to protect the underlying tissue. In the next video, we're going to start with simple epithelia, which consists of simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and a special case pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And we're going to go through all their characteristics while looking at pictures on the next video.